有这个机会可以跟你演讲，我是历史学家，所以我很高兴有这个机会跟你谈这个美国历史的一个非常重要的一部分。我中文名字是徐元音，我是出生在美国，可是小的时候住了台湾跟香港。I'm going to switch back to English now, but I do really want to thank the organizers of this event, and I'm so glad that so many of you have turned out to learn about this really important part of our national history. Oh, can you move to the next slide? So this is just the self-promotion page, but I want to draw your attention to, at the top there, Teach Immigration History. This is a free website platform. It lists key events in U.S. immigration history. It also includes different modules that give you an overview of key aspects in U.S. immigration history, including immigration of Asians, immigration within the Americas, family migrations. And so this is a resource that is available for those of you who want to learn more. I'm going to move very fast through this talk, and I hope it helps you think about some major issues. If you could move to the next slide. So I want to foreground a couple of key ideas for you to reflect on. We are a country that is sorely in need of reforms in immigration policy. Chinese immigrants, Chinese Americans are at the heart of these debates and understanding how the United States as a nation has managed its immigration policy. And immigration policy is extremely fraught. There is a lot of disagreement precisely because immigration policy is the key way in which the United States can shape its population to try to optimize national benefits, advantages. We have to think of those people who are U.S. citizens, those people who are Americans, whatever your legal status, as being the key resources that make for national greatness. And immigration policy is the way in which the United States government can most directly shape its population. Now, this being said, immigration policy is also a reflection of national values and priorities, and that for most of the U.S. history in which the United States has been actively trying to regulate migration, starting in the 1870s, the primary focus has been on race and national origin. And we should let that percolate and consider, are these really the kinds of values and priorities that really make for an effective, a humane, a rational system of how we try to decide who gets admitted into this country? And you can see from these very ugly images, Chinese were easy to target because you could identify them in laws by race. And so the Chinese exclusion laws will specify Chinese by race, and there will be these very ugly kinds of images circulated. It was a bipartisan issue. Chinese were represented as being a form of coolie labor akin to slavery that had just been abolished in the United States at at very high costs. Also portrayed here as a form of overwhelming the United States. And if you look at that graphic, this depiction of invasion really captures this contradiction. So on the one hand, you actually have Chinese workers, Chinese business people who are instrumental in developing the west coast of the United States, and in fact are highly contributing and productive, and yet this is seen as a kind of attack and a kind of undermining. Right? And so it's, even though Chinese Americans are such a small percentage of the national population, throughout history, nonetheless, they have been canaries in the coal mine. They have really sort of signaled the major changes in terms of U.S. attitudes towards trying to regulate immigration. But then as we see with repeal, the efforts to liberalize those immigration policies, and then also to make them serve more rational ends than racial discrimination and segregation. Okay, if you could move to the next slide. So here is sort of the main terms of the Chinese exclusion law, which when it was passed was actually worded very sort of neutrally as an act to uphold these treaty terms. And so the U.S. At this time actually wasn't certain about what kinds of authority it could have to enact immigration restriction targeting a specified population. There were some concerns that it would be offensive to the Chinese government, and so the U.S. government first undertook to negotiate a treaty with China claiming authority to limit but not absolutely suspend immigration by Chinese, okay? And so what the law does is it simply carries out the terms of the treaty agreement. But what happened in practice is that the U.S. government decided to enforce those laws as severely as possible, leading to the effort to accomplish Chinese exclusion, whereas the Chinese government had not expected this kind of sort of extreme implementation. And the Chinese government will make many efforts to negotiate on behalf of Chinese persons, but these will be set aside by the United States. Chinese in the United States will also make many, many attempts to push back against the expansion of federal authority regarding the sort of the extreme powers of the U.S. federal government to restrict, to enforce immigration laws. And we should know, we have all of these elected officials here encouraging you to participate in U.S. government, to understand its processes, which all of you are doing by coming today. Chinese understood the terms of the 14th Amendment. They understood to hire lawyers. They understood to try to challenge laws that were singling them out in courts all the way up to the level of the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, with regards to immigration, Chinese will consistently lose those cases. And so we must pay attention to Chinese American history because Chinese Americans and the exclusion laws against them and the expansion of U.S. immigration bureaucracy that resulted after, as the United States government decides it really wants to limit and restrict immigration. The foundations of all of these powers, for example, the authority to detain, also to deport, the requirement that people bear documents verifying their immigration status, this all was carved out with regard to Chinese, right? And Chinese tried to fight this sort of targeting of them, but what the Supreme Court will rule is that when it comes to cases of potential immigrants, of people who are of alien status, the United States government has virtually unconfined authority, okay? And so this is why we need to pay attention to Chinese American history. Okay, if we can move to the next slide. Now, I'm going to move very quickly to the terms of repeal. And the terms of repeal illustrate that federal government, sort of many key parties in the United States, including many different community and ethnic organizations, are asking for there to be a sort of a complicating, a sort of more nuance in terms of immigration policy, a shift away from the emphasis on race and national origins. And so some of the key events that happen, it's no accident that repeal happens during World War II when China was the key ally of the United States in the Pacific theater, right? And I share these images to reflect that there is a shift to recognize that political alignments, that shared international relationships also should be considered alongside factors of belief in racial difference and hierarchy and inassimilability in your immigration laws. This was strategically, you can move to the next slide, critical during World War II because the Japanese government was actively campaigning. Oh, this is the slide about Madame Chiang Kai-shek. We also have examples of Chinese Americans who demonstrate just that if we look at Chinese as individuals, as human beings, there are some who are superlatively would be superlatively welcome to become U.S. citizens. And so Madame Chiang Kai-shek really embodied this. She was perhaps the most famous Chinese person that people in the United States would know about. She was US educated, came from a Methodist family, was married to the leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, who had converted to Christianity. And she illustrated for many Americans this belief that Chinese people could be made more like Americans in their religion, but then also in their political practice. Madame Chiang Kai-shek openly told Congress, told the United States, what China wants is China is trying to forge its way to become a modern nation, is to be a democracy like the United States. And this all works very powerfully in terms of overcoming these beliefs focused on racial difference. Okay. And that's her, she went on a speaking tour in 1943. She spoke at the Hollywood Bowl, which had been, during World War II, people had not really been going, but for Madame Chiang Kai-shek, about 20,000 people turned out. It was a big crowd. She also spoke at Madison Square Garden. Okay, so some of the conditions for the repeal of exclusion. The wartime alliance. We should not underestimate the importance of political factors. Japan was openly campaigning in China for Chinese to reject the United States as an ally. How could the United States and China truly be friends and be collaborating when Chinese are the only group targeted by race for almost complete exclusion from the United States? Instead, Japan argued China should agree to a racial alliance with Japan under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was also going to be a problem, right? And Chinese did not take it up. But there was this kind of urgency. We also have the reality of the sort of recognition that in China, so my second book, The Good Immigrants, focuses on Chinese international students and the major influence they have had on the development of international education programs in the United States. And so we have this contradiction that even as exclusion was going on, we also had Chinese all the way back to the 1900s and 1910s were always among the most numerous of international students in the United States. We have people like Hu Shi, for example, Zhao Yuanren, were here in the United States, but because of the US immigration laws, these kinds of people didn't have options to stay here. And this is even more emphasized in World War II. There's a lot of sympathy for this group called the stranded students. They include people like Yang Zhenning and Zhao Yuan, Li Zhongdao, also Qian Xuesen, people of sort of the highest caliber. This is also at a time period when economic competitiveness is tied more and more to technological and scientific innovation, right? If you have brilliant people, if they are trained, it is really to your advantage to try to keep them in the United States, but you have these racist immigration laws, right? So there are many factors. There's a lot of sympathy in the United States, and actually different kinds of accommodations are made so that these international students can stay in the United States. Congress will vote eventually to fund them so they can complete their graduate degrees, and then also vote that they can legally find employment in this country. So there is a shifting out. Many of these Chinese will be able to stay and become Americans under different kinds of refugee accommodations. Okay, and so these are the terms under which repeal will happen. Okay, I'm going to try to keep an eye on time. I always talk too long. Okay, so next slide. Exclusion is ended through repeal, which is passed very, very quickly. As some of these posters note, there was a committee formed by influential Americans. Pearl Buck was one of the most prominent among them. The Minnesota representative, Walter Judd, was also a key player. He had formerly been a medical missionary in China. And they make this push for repeal. And if we look at it in terms of a legislative process, they make a decision to frame it very narrowly, only about Chinese, only about the U.S.'s World War II ally. There's also the reality that by this time there are very few Chinese in the United States. In the previous decade, immigration across the entire decade is just over 4,000 people, right? This also has to do with China's Civil War and then also the Great Depression. But Congress also realizes it can perform a sleight of hand. If it puts Chinese on the same immigration basis as Europeans, which sets up the system of national origin quotas, which is based on census counts, what you end up with is Chinese get a tiny quota, like only 105 per year. Right? Chinese do gain the important symbolism that they can now get citizenship, they can now naturalize. This is something that has been banned to Asians since 1790. But so there is a version of equality in which Chinese are being treated like Europeans, and yet nonetheless, because of the differential national origins quotas, still virtually have very little chances to immigrate. You can consider, in contrast, I think the immigration quota for a country like Germany was something like 35,000 per year, so significantly higher. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so but the repeal, and this is where I want to sort of project onto how repeal reflects the shift in policy, will be sort of the starting point where the United States is reforming its immigration laws to somewhat de-emphasize race, although it will take until the 1965 Immigration Act for that to be sort of removed as the primary criteria. There will be more legislation for refugees. This will help more Chinese to immigrate. In the 1952 Immigration Act, we have the end altogether of the racial restriction on citizenship. We have all countries, as they are coming into existence, being able to get national origins quotas. Although, again, it's an overtly discriminatory system, because if you have a low quota, you know how little the United States wants immigrants from your country, in contrast to the countries with very high quotas. So 85% of immigration quotas went to countries in Western and Northern Europe. So Japan, the former World War II enemy, is the last Asian country to gain citizenship and immigration rights. Let's see. Oh, if we can move to the next one. So here, we can see, and if you just sort of look in the immigration across the 1940s and 1950s, if China is supposed to be operating under an annual quota of 105, there are a lot more Chinese who are actually managing to immigrate than is supposed to be legally allowed. Some people manage to do this as refugees. This is a reflection of the growing recognition and the growing sympathy. Many Chinese, so for example, from Taiwan, there is a lot of eagerness among college graduates in Taiwan to apply for graduate school in the United States. And there is an understanding in Taiwan by 1955 that if you can just get into a school in the United States, you will be able to convert that into employment and probably be able to stay on permanently and regularize your status, right? So there's pressure that's being applied through refugee programs, also through Chinese Americans who come. They are able to get employment, they are upstanding members of their communities, and they are able to get their congressional representatives to apply for individual bills to request for them to stay. And there is also pressure applied by just sort of outstanding people who cannot stay in the United States, such as Li Zhongdao, T.D. Li, and Yang Zhenning, C.N. Yang, who will go on to be the first Chinese to win Nobel Prizes in physics. And if your immigration laws prevent people like this from being able to get U.S. citizenship and remain, your immigration laws are seriously broken. The 1952 McCarran-Walter Act does add, for the first time, a preference system based on individual sort of capacity. So there is an employment preference for people with skills that are needed in the United States. There's also a family reunification preference, right? And so this is shifting out towards kind of the predominant criteria that we see with the 1965 Immigration Act. Okay, if you can move on. Next slide. Okay, so one of the model immigrants that I refer to, of course, is the architect I.M. Pei, who is just internationally renowned. And his life encapsulates these shifts because he arrives as an international student in 1935. His brilliance is already recognized. He goes to MIT, I think, and then also Harvard. And he's able to stay because people know that he's an outstanding, brilliant talent, but then also there's sympathy for him. And during after the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, during World War II, and then during the Chinese Civil War, there's also strong pressure and recognition. We don't want to send people like this back to China that's in disarray. But then after 1949, there is really this competition against the communist world to try to hold on to the people who are sort of have the greatest capacities to make transformative changes, right? And so the Cold War, onset of the Cold War also shifts the, further emphasizes political alignment, but then also economic sort of potential and utility in terms of the stakes of immigration regulation. Okay, if we move to the next slide. Okay, here. So this is a map from the 1917 Immigration Act, which very baldly, through lines drawn on the map, identifies the parts of the world which were considered to have immigrants who were unwelcome, considered racially inassimilable and inferior to the United States, and this is called the barred zone, and the 1917 Immigration Act summarily dismissed all the people from this part of the world, okay? If we go to the next map, by 1965, you can no longer do this, right? Because all of these formerly colonized territories now were nations in their own right. They have seats in the United Nations, applies extraordinary pressure for the United States to end the openness, the open racism of its immigration laws, and enact the 1965 Immigration Act. Okay, so if we look at the next slide, I think it just shows the terms of it. I'm going to end here. I've already gone on too long. But this is to say that we need to think about immigration policy. We need to think about how powerful it is, how much it can advance the United States, but then also the kinds of national values that are being enshrined in our laws. And Chinese have always been at the center of these debates because Chinese can be both perils, but they can also be extraordinary Americans. And it is trying to shape the policy so that it is not just an application to Chinese, but to people in general. How do we make our immigration policies have these kinds of capacities to both be more humane, but also to advance our nation? Okay, I will stop. Thank you.